This rocky ridge in Provence, known as the Rocher de la Penne, lies about 7 kilometres west of the city of Arles, the ancient Arelate. It seems an unlikely place to discover evidence for Roman mastery of mechanised hydraulic power, and yet that evidence is precisely what was discovered here by the French archaeologist Fernand Benoit in excavations conducted between 1937 and 1939. What he uncovered was quite unexpected. It was the first archaeological evidence for Roman use of water-powered flour mills. The ridge is about 30 metres high, and the mill complex lies on its steep southern side. It's rather difficult to make sense of the overgrown remains on the ground today, but a model of the complex, now in the Museum of Arles, shows how the barbegal mill may once have looked. It had 16 overshot water wheels, arranged in 2 rows of 8. These wheels drove the millstones. At the top, an aqueduct channel divided to feed the 2 parallel mill races. The dividing channel is still evident. So too some of the steeply staggered chambers that held the water wheels. Each of these wheel emplacements is accompanied by a room for a millstone. The complex was supplied with water by an aqueduct from the limestone hills to the north. Somewhat confusingly, there are 2 aqueducts running parallel across the valley that leads to the ridge. The oldest of these is the original aqueduct built to supply Arles with water. When this reaches the Rocher de la Penne, it does not cross the ridge, but makes a right angle, and then turns west to follow the line of the ridge, heading towards Arles. The other aqueduct, which was built up against the first, leads to a cutting through the ridge, and was constructed specifically to supply the mill complex. It was initially thought that the entire complex belonged to the late antique period, and was in use for about 100 years, from the late 3rd until the late 4th century. This was based on the fact that the arches of the aqueduct supplying Arles employed a rubble and brick building technique typical of late antiquity. Benoit proposed that the barbegal mill was connected with the development of the city of Arles as an imperial capital in the 4th century, and thus it might have been the emperor's property. This late antique date for the mill complex was then used by scholars as evidence not of technological advance in Roman antiquity, but precisely the opposite. They argued that it was only with the decline of an abundance of slave labour in late antiquity that conditions forced people to adopt alternative sources of power. Barbegal thus anticipated the importance of water power in medieval times, and contrasted with conditions that were thought to have existed earlier. But it is now thought that Benoit's proposed dating is quite wrong. The mill was built in the early 2nd century AD. The rubble and brick construction of the aqueduct belongs to a late antique refurbishment. In the mortar lining of the aqueduct system associated with the construction of the mill was found a silver coin of Trajan minted between AD 103 and 111 in good condition, and the drainage channel at the base of the mill complex yielded pottery and coins ranging from the time of Augustus to the late 3rd century. This redating of the mill to an earlier period would make more sense. It coincides with the architectural heyday of the city of Arles, and it has been estimated that the barbegal mill could produce 4.5 tons of flour a day, sufficient to supply the inhabitants of the city, who perhaps numbered 12,000. Nevertheless, it remains unclear who built and owned the mill. Benoit proposed the emperors of the 4th century, but now that it's been redated, scholars have proposed that it was a municipal building belonging to the city of Arles. Yet others have pointed to the contemporary agricultural development of the surrounding countryside to argue that it could have been a private operation run by local landowners. Whatever the case, the date of the mill shows that the use of water power has nothing to do with the decline of slavery in antiquity. And since the discovery of the barbegal water mills, other similar complexes have been identified. The Romans clearly made use of hydraulic power in the High Empire, using water wheels to drive millstones, mechanical saws, and perhaps ore-crushing machines. The diverse application of the water wheel was not a characteristic of medieval times, but yet another symptom of the Roman desire to dominate nature, readily seen in the construction of aqueducts, roads, and artificial harbours.